At 22, Alara had already lost her grandmother, her home, and the last frayed thread of her history, all in the space of a single gray month that smelled of rain and disinfectant. All the people who were supposed to protect her, the aunts and uncles who spoke of shared blood but never shared a burden, left her with the echoing silence of a disconnected phone line and the sharp end of an eviction notice. So she was standing here, in the gravel lot of a self-storage facility under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, with the last of her cash folded into a small, tight square in her pocket. She had come to buy back a ghost. The auctioneer, a man whose face was a roadmap of ruptured capillaries, rattled through the rules with the enthusiasm of a metronome. Liens, abandonment, cash only, sold as is, where is. The crowd was a small pack of regulars, men mostly, who picked through the cast-off lives of others like gulls on a landfill. They knew each other, and they knew a loser when they saw one. When the corrugated metal door of Unit C-13 was rolled up with a shriek of tortured metal, a collective sigh of disappointment went through the group. It was junk. A mountain of it. Sagging cardboard boxes, a three-legged armchair weeping its stuffing, the skeletal frame of a cheap lamp. It was the wreckage of a life packed in a hurry and then forgotten. The auctioneer started the bidding at $50, a formality. Silence. $20. The men looked at their feet, at the sky, anywhere but at the pile of debris. $10, he barked, just to move it along, just to clear the unit so it could be rented again. And from the back of the small crowd, a voice, small but clear. $10. It was Alara. A few of the men turned to look at her, a flicker of pity, or maybe just mild surprise in their eyes, before turning away. Going once, going twice, the auctioneer chanted, his gavel a cheap hammer on a wooden clipboard. Sold for $10 to the girl in the back. As the other bidders moved on to the next unit, a ripple of low laughter followed them, the sound of easy judgment. They were laughing at the junk, at the insult of a $10 bid, at the girl who was foolish enough to pay for the privilege of hauling away someone else's trash. But what nobody knew, what the laughing men and the bored auctioneer and even Alara herself did not yet understand, was that the true inheritance wasn't the pile of worthless things that filled the space. It was taped to the underside of the lid of an old cedar chest buried at the very bottom of the heap. That, though, comes later. First, there was the letter. It had arrived not in a personal envelope, but in a crisp, windowed one with a corporate logo in the corner, a name that meant nothing and everything: Thorn Consolidated Holdings. The paper was thick, the language cold and absolute. It spoke of acquisition, of new management, of transition periods. It was a document scrubbed clean of all humanity. A string of legal clauses that added up to one simple fact. They were to be erased. The building, the one her grandmother Maeve had lived in for 40 years, the one where Alara had spent every summer and holiday of her life, had been sold. Her grandmother had read the letter, her glasses perched on the end of her nose, her lips a thin, tight line. "They want to buy my memories," she had said, her voice quiet but with a core of iron Alara had always admired. "They want to put a price on the light from that window in the morning." She had folded the letter neatly and placed it not in the trash, but in the back of her sewing box, a piece of evidence in a crime not yet fully committed. Maeve had been a woman of quiet rituals and unyielding principles. She believed that a person's home was not a commodity but a sanctuary, a living thing that held the imprint of a life lived within its walls. She had refused their offers, the escalating sums of money that Thorn Consolidated sent in ever thicker envelopes, offers that made the other tenants, one by one, pack their lives into boxes and disappear. Maeve called it blood money. "You can't buy a home," she'd tell Alara, stirring a pot of soup that smelled of time and patience. "You can only build one. And a family is built, not born." After Maeve was gone, the quiet departure in the night that left a hole in the world, the letters stopped. In their place came a notice, this one thinner, cheaper, taped to the door. It spoke of lease violations, of unauthorized occupants, of termination. It gave Ilara 24 hours. 24 hours to dismantle a life. She had tried. She had packed boxes with a frantic, desperate energy, her hands shaking, her throat tight with unshed tears. But how do you pack 40 years? How do you sort the sacred from the mundane, when every object, every chipped teacup and faded photograph, hummed with the memory of the woman who was gone? She had called her aunt, her mother's sister, whose voice on the phone was distant and cautious. They'd offered to help, of course, but the timing was bad. There was a trip planned, a conference. They sent their sympathies. They did not send a moving truck. So the 24 hours passed, and on the second day, a crew in clean uniforms arrived, their faces impassive. They worked with a chilling efficiency, piling Maeve's life into heavy-duty trash bags. The armchair, the lamp, the sewing box with the letters still inside. It was all hauled away, destined for a landfill, except for a portion of it, the portion that was moved to Unit C-13, a procedural step to justify the lien, the cost of its own disposal now a debt against an estate that didn't exist. The final insult. The contents of a life, appraised, found wanting, and sold for $10. Ilara slid the heavy lock from the latch, the metal cold against her palm. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of dust and time and something else, something like cedar and old paper. She pulled, and the door rolled up with that same metallic scream. And she stood, for a long moment, just looking at the chaos she now owned. The chaos had a smell. It was the smell of a sealed room, of trapped air, of dust motes that had danced in slivers of light for months before settling on every surface, a fine gray blanket over everything. It was the smell of old wool and yellowing paper, of cheap particle board slowly surrendering its form, and underneath it all, the faint, sharp scent of mothballs, a futile attempt to preserve things against the one enemy you can never defeat. Time. Ilara stood at the threshold, the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway behind her cutting a sharp rectangle onto the floor, illuminating the first few feet of wreckage. A tower of boxes, their sides bowed outward, pregnant with forgotten things, listed precariously to the left. A single tennis shoe, its sole splitting from the upper, lay on its side like a fallen soldier. The lampshade, stripped of its fabric, was a cage of wires, a skeleton. It was more than a mess, it was an archaeology of collapse. It was the physical manifestation of her own grief, a landscape of things broken and discarded. She felt a wave of despair so profound it was almost paralyzing. What had she done? What mad hope had propelled her to spend her last $10 on this monument to loss? The laughter of the other bidders echoed in her ears, no longer distant but sharp, accusatory. She had bought a tomb and the job of being its undertaker. For a few long moments, she considered just closing the door, sliding the lock back into place, walking away and leaving the key on the indifferent counter of the front office. She could just vanish, become as much a ghost as her grandmother. It would be easy. It would be a relief. But then she saw it. Through the gloom, at the very back of the 10 by 20 foot space, was a small detail that was out of place. Amid the jumble of furniture piled at odd angles and the chaotic spill of boxes, there was a single, neat stack of 3 identical cartons. Unlike the others, which were sealed with aging, yellowed tape, these were bound with clean, tight bands of clear packing tape, the corners perfect, the seams aligned with a geometric precision. It was an island of order in an ocean of entropy. It was Maeve. In that small, almost invisible detail, Ilara saw her grandmother as clearly as if she were standing there. Maeve, who believed that any job worth doing was worth doing well. Maeve, who mended a torn seam with stitches so small they were nearly invisible, who polished her old silver until it shone like new, who found a quiet satisfaction in bringing order to the small corners of her world. They took the house, they took the savings, they took her name off the door. But they couldn't take the way she folded her towels or the way she taped a box. It was a signature, a message. Something in Ilara shifted. The despair didn't vanish, but it receded, making way for a different feeling, a stubborn spark of curiosity. She took a step inside, the crunch of grit under her worn sneakers sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. She ran a hand along the top of a dusty dresser, leaving a clean streak in the grime. This was not a tomb. It was a puzzle. She remembered the stories Maeve used to tell, not grand family histories, but small fables of everyday life. She'd say that you could tell the measure of a person, not by the things they owned, but by the way they cared for them. A man who lets his tools rust, she'd say, will let his promises rust too. A home isn't just walls and a roof, it's 100 small acts of attention. Elara started to work. She didn't try to tackle the mountain all at once. She started with what was in front of her, a lesson Maeve had taught her in the garden. Don't look at all the weeds, she'd said. Just look at the one at your feet. Pull that one, then the next. So Elara pulled the first box, a flimsy thing from a liquor store, its bottom threatening to give way. Inside, a jumble of kitchen utensils, mismatched forks and spoons, a whisk with a bent handle, a collection of rubber bands so old they crumbled to dust in her fingers. Worthless, she set it aside. The next box held old clothes, the fabric imbued with that faint, sweet scent that had been uniquely Maeve's. Elara pulled out a soft, gray cardigan, the elbows worn thin. She held it to her face for a moment, closing her eyes, and for a heartbeat, the grief was so fresh, so sharp, it stole her breath. She folded it carefully, reverently, and placed it on top of the dresser. This she would keep. The hours blurred. She worked with a slow, methodical rhythm, sorting, stacking, creating small territories of order. A pile for trash, a pile for keeping, a pile for, she wasn't sure. The sun arced across the sky, its journey marked only by the changing angle of the light that leaked under the metal door. The air in the unit grew thick and close. Her back ached. Her hands were black with grime. But she kept going, driven by the image of those 3 perfectly taped boxes at the back, her distant prize. She was unearthing a life, not just its possessions. She found a box of paperback novels, their spines broken, their pages filled with Maeve's spidery annotations. A tin box of buttons, a kaleidoscope of colors and sizes. A photo album filled not with people, but with pictures of flowers from her small window box garden, each one labeled with its Latin name. There was nothing of monetary value, no hidden jewelry, no forgotten savings bonds. Just the humble, everyday objects that had been the backdrop to a quiet life. And yet, the more she sorted, the more the feeling grew. This wasn't random. Maeve had known this was coming. The chaos was a camouflage, a dragon guarding a treasure. And the treasure wasn't gold or silver. It was a story, and she, Elara, was the only one left who knew how to read it. The diner was called the Daily Bread, and it was one of those places that seemed to exist outside of time. The chrome on the counter stools was worn through to the metal underneath, the red vinyl on the booths was patched with silver duct tape, and the air was permanently scented with coffee, bacon, and the faint, sweet smell of bleach. It was run by a woman named Lena, a woman who seemed as permanent as the building itself. Lena had a face that had seen too many long nights and a heart that had somehow remained open. Her hands, gnarled with arthritis, were never still, constantly wiping down the counter, refilling a sugar dispenser, or sliding a plate of food in front of someone who looked like they needed it. She had known Maeve for 30 years. When Elara walked in, covered in a fine layer of dust and exhaustion, Lena just pointed a thumb toward a booth in the corner. "You look like you're wrestling with ghosts," Lena said, setting a tall glass of water on the table without being asked. "And from the looks of you, the ghosts are winning." She returned a moment later with a bowl of tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich, the bread thick and buttery, the cheese stretching in long, satisfying strings. "Eat. Maeve would have my hide if I let you waste away." Elara hadn't realized how hungry she was. She ate in silence for a few minutes, the warmth of the soup spreading through her, chasing away some of the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Lena watched her from behind the counter, her expression a mixture of concern and something else, something like recognition. "You've got her hands," Lena said finally, breaking the silence. Alara looked down at her own grimy fingers, the nails broken, the knuckles scraped. "What?" "Your grandmother's hands," Lena clarified, coming over to sit in the opposite side of the booth, a mug of coffee cupped in her own hands. She had workers' hands, always. Even when she was wearing her Sunday best, you could see it. A little bit of paint under a nail, a callus on her thumb. She was always making something, fixing something. This wasn't the grandmother Alara had known. The grandmother she knew was soft scents and warm hugs, stories before bed and cookies cooling on a rack. She was a presence, a feeling, not a person with paint under her nails. "She was the most private person I ever knew," Lena continued, her gaze distant, lost in a memory. "But she saw things. She saw when Mrs. Henderson down the hall couldn't afford groceries, and a bag would just appear on her doorstep. She saw when the kid in 3B needed a new coat for winter, and one would show up in the lost and found. She never said a word, never wanted thanks. She just saw a hole and filled it." Lena took a slow sip of her coffee. "Your grandmother paid for every meal she ever ate in here with cash. Always. And she always left a $20 tip, even if all she had was a cup of coffee. I tried to give it back to her once, early on. She got this look on her face, not angry, just firm. She said, 'Some debts aren't paid to the person you owe. They're paid forward.' She said a community is like a quilt. You can't see the whole pattern when you're just one square, but every stitch matters." Alara thought about the boxes in the storage unit, the jumble of a life. Was that what this was? Not just junk, but the leftover thread, the scraps from 1,000 hidden stitches. "That man," Alara said, her voice quiet. "The one who bought the building. Thorne." Lena's face darkened. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, hard anger. "Marcus Thorne calls himself a developer. He's a vulture. Comes in, tears down communities he calls blighted, and puts up glass boxes for people who don't even live in them half the year. He thinks everything and everyone has a price tag." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low growl. "Your grandmother was the only one who didn't fold. He hated her for it. He saw her as a loose thread in his perfect, profitable tapestry. When she passed, he couldn't move fast enough to snip it." The grilled cheese sat heavy in Alara's stomach. The story was bigger than she had thought. It wasn't just about a lost apartment. It was about a war, a quiet war, fought by a woman with workers' hands and a belief in unseen debts. "There's one more thing," Alara said, almost afraid to ask. "Did my grandmother have a dog? A mutt, kind of scruffy, getting gray around the muzzle?" Lena's eyes lit up. "Buster!" "Of course. That old dog was her shadow, followed her everywhere." "What happened to him?" "After. I think they took him to the county shelter," Alara said, a new, fierce resolve hardening within her. The ghosts were still there, but she wasn't wrestling them anymore. She was starting to recognize them. She was starting to see the pattern. "Lena," Alara said, pushing her empty bowl away. "Can I get a coffee to go?" Lena smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached her eyes. "I'll do you one better," she said, standing up. She came back from the kitchen with a thermos of coffee and a paper bag. Inside were 2 more sandwiches and a handful of bacon wrapped in a napkin. "For Buster," Lena said, with a wink. "And remember what Maeve said, a family is built, not born. Looks to me like you're in the construction business." The system was designed for failure. That was the cold, hard truth Alara came to understand as she stood in line at the county clerk's office, waiting to get the paperwork that would allow her to get the paperwork that would let her visit the shelter. Everything was a form, a fee, a line, a window that would close in 10 minutes. It was a system of deliberate friction, designed to wear people down, to make them give up. It was the same logic that had taken her grandmother's home. The eviction had been technically legal. Marcus Thorne's lawyers were experts in the art of the loophole. Maeve's lease, 40 years old and written on a typewriter, was an ironclad agreement with a landlord long since dead. But when Thorne Consolidated Holdings bought the building, they didn't just buy the brick and mortar, they bought the paper it was built on. They had pored over that old lease, looking for a weakness, a crack. They found one. A clause, standard at the time, about the lease terminating upon the death of the primary tenant, with no provision for succession, not even for family who had been living there. It was a relic of a different era, a legal tripwire left forgotten for decades. For Thorne, it was a gift. The day after Maeve's small, quiet funeral, the notice appeared. It wasn't just an eviction, it was a negation. Ilara, who had been living there, caring for Maeve in her final months, was rendered invisible, an unauthorized occupant. Her grief was irrelevant, her history was inadmissible. She was a legal fiction to be erased. The wrong was not just the eviction itself, but the chilling precision of it, the speed, the utter lack of humanity. They had offered her nothing, no time, no assistance, no compassion. Just the cold, hard edge of the law, wielded like a weapon. Now, standing in the fluorescent-lit hallway of the storage facility, the memory of that injustice was a hot coal in her chest. The auction had been the final act of that violation. The storage company, following its own rigid protocol, had seized the contents of Maeve's apartment to cover the costs of removal and disposal. They had moved it to Unit C13, slapped a lien on it, and after the legally mandated waiting period, put it up for public auction. The value of a life's possessions, according to their ledgers, was exactly the cost of the labor to move it and the rent on the unit for 3 months. A few $100s. The auction was a way to recoup that debt. The auctioneer, the bored bidders, they weren't evil. They were just cogs in the same machine. They were part of a system that had learned to put a price on everything and a value on nothing. Worth was not the same as price. Maeve's words echoed in her mind. Ilara looked at the $10 bill she had given the auctioneer, the last $10 she had in the world. It felt like a pittance, an insult, but now she saw it differently. The other bidders, the professionals, they had assessed the unit's contents and found them worthless. They were looking for things they could flip, things with a clear, immediate resale value. A flat-screen TV, a set of golf clubs, a box of power tools. They saw none of that, so they saw nothing. They couldn't see the worn elbows on a cardigan. They couldn't see the love in a perfectly taped box. They couldn't see the story. Ilara had not been bidding on the junk. She had been bidding on the story. She had paid $10 not for what was in the unit, but for the right to stand her ground in it. It was the first act of defiance in a war she was only just beginning to understand. She had scraped together that $10 from the change at the bottom of her purse and the coins in the donation jar Lena had pressed into her hand along with the sandwiches. It was everything she had. And in that moment, bidding on the pile of her own history, she had felt a strange sense of power. It was the power of showing up. The power of refusing to let the story end with a closed door and a settled account. The wrong had been done to her, to Maeve's memory, but the final chapter had not yet been written. She was the author now, and she had just bought the book. Her first act as the new owner was to buy a heavy-duty padlock from the facility's front office, using the last few dollars from Lena's jar. The lock was absurdly large and new against the rust-stained latch. It was a statement. This is mine. You will not take this too. She clicked it shut, the sound echoing in the long, quiet hallway. It was a small sound, but for Ilara, it was a thunderclap. It was the sound of the beginning. The county animal shelter was a low brick building that smelled of antiseptic and a deep, abiding sadness. The sound of barking, a frantic, desperate chorus, hit Ilara the moment she stepped out of the cab Lena had insisted on calling for her. Each bark was a question. Are you the one? Are you here for me? Inside, a young woman with tired eyes and a kind smile checked her paperwork. Buster, she said, tapping on her keyboard. Yes, we have him. He came in as a stray pickup. Landlord call. The words hung in the air, clinical and cold. Landlord call. Thorne's reach was long. He's been quiet, the woman said, her voice gentle. He's an older gentleman. These places are hard on the seniors. He's in the back, not really up for the main kennels. She led Ilara down a quiet corridor, away from the cacophony of the main adoption floor. Here, the kennels were larger, the atmosphere calmer. And in the last one, a small figure was curled on a thin blanket, his back to the door. He was a scruffy, medium-sized mutt, his coat a model of gray and black and brown. His muzzle was white with age, and one ear flopped down while the other stood at a slight, inquisitive angle. He didn't move as they approached. "Buster?" Ilara said, her voice barely a whisper. The dog's one good ear twitched. He lifted his head slowly, his old bones protesting the movement. He looked at her, his brown eyes cloudy with age, but filled with a deep, weary intelligence. He didn't bark or wag his tail. He just watched her. "It's me, boy," Ilara said, crouching down by the wire door. "It's Ilara. Maeve's Ilara." At the sound of the name, the dog's tail gave a single, tentative thump against the concrete floor. He struggled to his feet, a little unsteady, and walked slowly to the front of the kennel. He pushed his nose through the chain link and let out a soft whine. It was a sound of such profound loneliness that it broke Ilara's heart. She paid the fees, a sum that felt both astronomical and insignificant, and walked out of the shelter with the old dog trotting quietly beside her on a frayed rope leash. Buster seemed to understand the solemnity of the occasion. He didn't pull or sniff, just stayed close to her leg, his presence a warm, solid anchor. Back at the storage facility, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the gravel lot. Sal, the manager, a man whose weary posture suggested he was holding up the roof with his own shoulders, watched them approach from the doorway of his small office. His eyes, small and buried in a fleshy face, flickered from Ilara to the dog and back again. He said nothing, but his disapproval was a palpable thing. Ilara slid the key into her new padlock and rolled up the door. The familiar smell of dust and memory washed over them. Buster, who had been placid and slow, suddenly came alive. His nose twitched. His tail began to wag, a slow, steady rhythm. He walked into the unit, his claws clicking on the concrete, and began to move through the maze of furniture with a purpose Ilara did not understand. He wasn't just sniffing randomly, he was on a mission. He ignored the boxes of clothes, the broken armchair, the kitchen supplies. He moved with a strange certainty toward the back of the unit, to a corner that was dark and cluttered. And there, he stopped. In the corner, wedged between a stack of old magazines and a rolled-up rug, was a large, plain-looking cedar chest. It was old, its surface scarred and dull, its metal bindings tarnished. To Ilara, it was just one more piece of unwanted furniture. To Buster, it was the center of the universe. He circled it once, sniffing at its base, and then, with a soft grunt, he lay down in front of it, his body a furry barrier. He rested his gray muzzle on his paws and fixed his eyes on Ilara, a look of profound and patient expectation on his face. "What is it, boy?" Ilara whispered. Buster just thumped his tail once, a single, definitive beat. He was not moving. This was the spot. This was where they were meant to be. Ilara looked from the dog to the chest. It was an anomaly. Everything else in the unit was a jumble, things stacked to fit, to fill space. But there was a small, clear area on the floor around the chest, as if it had been deliberately set apart. She had been so focused on the perfectly taped boxes that she hadn't even noticed it. Now she couldn't look away. The loyal old dog, a silent witness, had led her here. He had kept his vigil in the lonely shelter, waiting. He had held the memory of his purpose, even when everything else was gone. And now he was here, guarding a secret, waiting for her to be ready to see it. Ilara sat down on the dusty floor opposite him. The old dog and the young woman, two orphans in a sea of forgotten things. The silence in the unit was no longer empty, it was filled with a question. The chest was nothing special. It was a standard-issue cedar hope chest, the kind that was once a staple in a young woman's life, filled with linens and dreams for a future that was always just over the horizon. This one was old, its cedar scent faded to a ghost of its former self, mingling with the dominant smell of dust. The wood was scratched and dented, a record of a long and utilitarian life. The metal bands that wrapped its corners were dull and spotted with rust. It was, by all accounts, just another piece of junk. But Buster remained planted in front of it, a furry sphinx guarding his pyramid. Ilara tried to coax him away with a piece of the bacon Lena had given her. He ate it gratefully, licking her fingers with a dry, raspy tongue. But the moment the food was gone, he resettled himself in the exact same spot, his message clear. The bacon is appreciated, but the job remains. Frustrated, Ilara decided to work around him. She began to clear the space, moving the rolled-up rug, stacking the yellowing piles of magazines. The more she cleared, the more the chest seemed to assert its presence. It wasn't just in the corner, it was the corner. Everything else had been arranged around it. As she worked, she started to notice small things, details that didn't fit. The lid of the chest, a heavy, solid slab of wood, didn't sit quite flush with the base. There was a gap on one side, no wider than a credit card, but it was there. And the hinges on the back, when she ran her fingers over them, were different from the other hardware. While the lock plate on the front was tarnished and pitted, the hinges were smooth, clean, and felt new. She scraped at one with her fingernail, and a tiny fleck of something that looked like fresh oil came away. Someone had been maintaining these hinges. Recently. Her curiosity piqued, she decided to try and open it. The lock on the front was a simple brass plate with a keyhole, but there was no key. She tugged at the lid. It was incredibly heavy, far heavier than a simple plank of cedar should be. It wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, bracing her feet against the floor, her muscles straining. Nothing. It was as if it were bolted shut. Buster watched her struggle, his head cocked to one side, his expression unreadable. "What is in here, boy?" She grunted, giving the lid one last, futile heave. She sat back on her heels, sweating and frustrated. Maybe it was just full of old, heavy blankets, weighing the lid down. Maybe the wood had swelled in the damp air. She was about to give up, to move on to the tantalizing stack of neat boxes at the back, when she remembered Maeve's other favorite saying, "If a door won't open, you're pushing on the wrong part." She ran her hands over the surface of the chest again, not trying to force it, but to understand it. She felt along the seams, the edges, the places where wood met wood. And that's when she found it. Not a lock or a latch, but a slight unevenness on the front panel, just below the lock plate. It was a small section of the decorative molding, no more than a few inches long. It looked just like the rest of the trim, but when she pushed on it, it gave way with a soft, satisfying click. It wasn't a button. It was a wooden spring latch disguised as ornamentation. She heard a faint mechanical thud from within the chest. She lifted the lid again, and this time it rose with an almost effortless grace, the well-oiled hinges doing their work, revealing the contents. Her first feeling was a crushing wave of disappointment. Blankets. The chest was filled to the brim with old, woolen blankets. They were heavy, scratchy, and smelled faintly of mothballs. All that effort, all that mystery, for a box of army surplus blankets. Buster whined softly, as if sensing her deflation. She sighed, running a hand through her hair, scattering dust. She had been so sure. The new hinges, the secret latch, it had all pointed to something more. She felt foolish, like a child who had been taken in by a cheap magic trick. She reached in to pull one of the blankets out, thinking she could at least use it to cover the broken armchair, and her fingers brushed against something stiff and smooth. She pushed the top blanket aside, and then another, and another. The blankets were a lie. They were a cover, a weighted camouflage. Beneath them, the chest was empty, but as she stood up, ready to close the lid on her disappointment, her head brushed against the underside of the heavy lid itself. Her eyes followed the motion, and she froze. Taped to the rough, unfinished wood of the lid's interior, almost invisible in the dim light, was a small, flat, plain manila envelope. It was held in place by 4 strips of yellowing cellophane tape, one at each corner. It was so simple, so unassuming, it would have been easy to miss. But it was there. Her heart started to pound, a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached up, her fingers trembling slightly, and touched the corner of the envelope. It was real. This was it. The laughter of the auctioneers, the coldness of the eviction, the exhaustion and the grief, it all fell away, leaving only this single, silent point of focus. The hidden latch, the heavy lid, the blankets, it was all a test. A series of obstacles designed to be overcome only by someone who was patient. Someone who was looking for more than just surface value. Someone who would take the time to look up. She carefully peeled back the brittle tape, her breath held tight in her chest. The envelope came free. It was light, almost weightless in her hand. It contained a secret she had paid $10 for, a secret a loyal old dog had guarded with his life. And she was finally ready to open it. The envelope was unsealed. Ilara's fingers, clumsy with a mixture of grime and adrenaline, fumbled with the flap. She half expected it to crumble in her hands, a relic turned to dust by time and neglect. But the paper was surprisingly sturdy, a good quality stock that had weathered its confinement. She tilted the envelope, and 2 items slid into her palm. The first was a key. It was small and brass, of a type she didn't recognize. Not a house key or a car key, but something older, more intricate. It was a skeleton key, the kind you saw in old movies, with a decorative, clover-shaped head and a simple toothed bit. It was cool and solid in her hand, a small piece of tangible reality in this place of ghosts and memories. The second item was a single sheet of heavy paper, folded into a neat, tight square. She unfolded it carefully, the creases sharp and permanent. It wasn't a letter. There were no words, no greetings, no explanations. It was a diagram, hand-drawn in fine black ink with a ruler-straight precision. It was a floor plan. She recognized it immediately. It was the layout of Unit C13, a simple rectangle, 10 feet by 20 feet. An arrow marked the front, labeled door. But at the back of the rectangle, her grandmother had drawn another, thinner line, running parallel to the rear wall, just a few inches from it. And on that thin line, she had drawn a small X in the center. That was all. A key that fit no visible lock, and a map to a place she already was. Ilara stared at the drawing, her mind racing. A false wall? It seemed impossible. The walls of the unit were just thin, corrugated metal, bolted onto a steel frame. She ran her hand along the back wall, the cold metal rippling under her palm. It felt solid. She knocked on it, a dull, flat thud. Nothing. No hollow sound, no echo. Nothing to suggest there was a space behind it. She looked at the key in her hand. She looked at the X on the map. She looked at Buster, who was now sitting up, watching her with an unnerving intensity, as if he knew exactly what the paper said. It didn't make sense. And yet, every part of her, every instinct that had been honed by her grandmother's quiet lessons, told her to trust the map. Trust the process. Maeve had not been a woman of whimsy. If she had gone to the trouble of creating this elaborate puzzle, the hidden latch, the weighted lid, the secret envelope, it was for a reason. And the reason was on this paper. This was the next step. She felt a surge of exhilaration, the thrill of a puzzle piece clicking into place. She was on the right path. She was reading the story. She was. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a little longer, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. It is one thing to find a map, and another thing to follow it, especially when the path leads to a place you cannot see. Alara was standing at that very crossroads, holding a promise in one hand and a question in the other. She spent the next hour searching for the lock that matched the key. She tried it on the old cedar chest, even though she knew it wouldn't work. She tried it on a small, locked toolbox she found under a pile of newspapers. She even, in a moment of desperate hope, tried it on the absurdly large padlock she herself had just bought for the unit door. Nothing. She went back to the drawing, staring at the X as if it would magically reveal its secrets. What was she missing? She paced the length of the small unit, the 10 steps from the door to the back wall becoming a familiar rhythm. Door, wall, wall, door. Buster watched her, his head turning to follow her, a silent observer in a private theater. The initial euphoria began to fade, replaced by a creeping frustration. The world outside the metal box of the unit, with its demands for rent and food and a future, began to press in on her again. This was a fool's errand. She was a grown woman playing a treasure hunt game designed by a dead person. She was about to crumple the paper in her fist, to give in to the wave of despair that was always waiting at the edges of her mind, when a voice from the doorway startled her. "Findin' everything you paid for?" It was Sal, the manager. He stood there, silhouetted against the bright hallway light, his arms crossed over his ample stomach. His tone was a lazy drawl, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. They darted from the open chest to the piles of sorted junk, to the key still clutched in Alara's hand. "Looks like you're making a dent," he said, though it wasn't a compliment. It was an observation, tinged with something she couldn't quite name. Resentment? Pity? "It's a lot of work," Alara said, tucking the key and the map into her pocket, her movements furtive, guilty. "Yeah, well," he said, rocking back on his heels. "That's what $10 gets you. A lot of work." He lingered for a moment longer, his presence filling the doorway. "Just so you know," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "the clock's tickin'. Rent on this unit is due on the 1st. No exceptions." He didn't need to say what would happen if she missed the payment. She knew the rules. The contents would be seized, the unit would go back to auction. The cycle would begin again. With a final, lingering look, he turned and walked away, his heavy footsteps echoing down the concrete hall. His visit had broken the spell. The unit suddenly felt smaller, colder. The puzzle no longer felt like a game, but a race against a clock she hadn't known was running. The encounter with Sal left a chill in the air, a greasy film of reality smearing the fragile window of hope she had just opened. The clock was ticking. Rent. The word was an iron weight. She had no money, no job, and a looming deadline that made her secret quest feel frivolous, insane. Doubt, a cold and creeping vine, began to wrap itself around her heart. But then a new sound cut through the silence. A polite cough from the hallway. Alara turned, her body tense, expecting to see Sal again. But it wasn't Sal. The man standing in the doorway of her unit was his opposite in every conceivable way. He was tall and slender, dressed in a suit so sharply tailored it seemed to repel the dust of the hallway. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and his silver hair was combed back from a face that was handsome, smooth, and utterly devoid of warmth. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a low, cultured purr. "I was told I might find a Miss Ilara Vance here." Ilara's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. She had heard it once before, on a voicemail left on her grandmother's machine, a voice that was smooth as silk and just as strong. It was Marcus Thorne. "I'm Alara," she said, her own voice coming out small and thin. She hated the weakness in it. Thorne's eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept over the unit, taking in the scene with a practiced, appraising glance. He wasn't looking at the objects. He was calculating their weight, their volume, the cost of their disposal. His gaze rested for a moment on the open cedar chest, then on Alara, and his smile widened by a millimeter. "A pleasure to finally meet you," he said. "I'm Marcus Thorne. I knew your grandmother, in a professional capacity, of course. A remarkable woman. Very principled." The way he said the word principled turned it into an insult, a synonym for difficult. What do you want? Elara asked, her hands balling into fists in her pockets. The paper map crinkled under her knuckles. Straight to the point. I admire that, Thorn said, taking a step into the unit, invading her small space. He exuded an expensive cologne that smelled of sandalwood and power. I'm here to make you an offer. I understand this unit and its contents now belong to you. A technicality of the estate, so to speak. My company, as a gesture of goodwill for your loss, would like to purchase it from you. To save you the trouble of dealing with it all. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a thick envelope. $500, he said, fanning the crisp new bills for her to see. Cash. For a $10 investment, that's not a bad return, you'll agree. You sign a simple bill of sale, and you can walk away from all this. Be free of it. It was a threat wrapped in a favor. The money was a dismissal, a way of telling her that her history, her grandmother's life, had a clear and paltry price. $500 to make her go away. $500 to ensure whatever secret Maeve had hidden stayed hidden. Because he was here. That was the fact that screamed in Elara's mind. Why was he here? Why would the head of a multi-million-dollar corporation personally come to a rundown storage facility to buy a pile of junk? He knew, or he suspected. He knew there was something more to Maeve than old furniture, and he was here to bury it for good. No, Elara said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the space between them with the force of a thrown stone. Thorn's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of annoyance, of genuine surprise, crossed his eyes. I'm sorry? No, Elara repeated, louder this time. It's not for sale. Thorn stared at her for a long moment, his mask of polite condescension slipping. He saw not a grieving, destitute young woman, but a problem, an obstacle, the same obstacle Maeve had been. That's a mistake, he said, his voice losing its purr and taking on a hard, metallic edge. This whole area is slated for redevelopment. This facility is being demolished in a month. That 500 will look pretty good when the bulldozers are at the door. He slid the money back into his pocket. The offer is on the table for 24 hours. Think about it. He turned and walked away, his polished shoes silent on the concrete, leaving the scent of his cologne hanging in the air like a poison. The stakes had just been raised. The race wasn't against a rental payment. It was against a bulldozer. A month. She had a month to solve a puzzle that had already taken her days to even begin. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her defiance. That night, she didn't leave. She bought a cheap flashlight from the office vending machine and worked by its thin, wavering beam. She had to find the answer. She went back to the only clues she had, the key and the map. She searched every inch of the back wall again, pressing, tapping, looking for a seam, a keyhole, anything. Nothing. Defeated, she sank down onto a pile of Maeve's old coats, the ones she had set aside to donate. The wool was rough against her cheek. She was exhausted, her hope worn down to a nub. As she shifted her weight, her hand slid into the pocket of the top coat, a heavy tweed jacket Maeve had worn for gardening, and her fingers closed around another envelope. This one was smaller, softer, the paper worn and pliable from being carried for a long time. It was sealed with a simple fold. Her name, Elara, was written on the front in Maeve's familiar, spidery script. This was it. This was the letter. Her hands shaking, she tore it open. The letter was short, written on a single page torn from a notebook. My dearest Elara, it began. If you are reading this, then you were patient. You looked past the mess. I knew you would. I am sorry to leave you with a puzzle, but some things cannot be said plainly. Some things must be earned. What I have left you is not in the unit. The unit is the inheritance. It is a place to stand, a place to begin. Remember what I told you. Worth is not the same as price. And a family is built, not born. You are my family. The key does not open a lock, it is a lock. The back wall, my dear girl, The back wall is a door. Measure twice, cut once. All my love, Maeve. It was cryptic, maddening, and beautiful. The key is a lock. The wall is a door. And then the final line, a craftsman's proverb. Measure twice, cut once. She looked at the drawing again. The X. It wasn't a location, it was an instruction. She looked at the key, the clover-shaped head, the simple, toothed bit. It wasn't a key for turning. It was a tool, a template. She held the head of the key against the wall, right where the X was on her map. And she understood. It was a guide for a cut. Maeve had left her a map, a key, and a final instruction. She had left her a chance. All Alara had to do was find the courage to make the first cut. The next morning, the air in the unit was thick with the smell of ozone from an impending storm and the electric tang of Alara's resolve. Maeve's words had been a transfusion, replacing the fear in her veins with a hot, steady purpose. The wall is a door. She now had to figure out how to open it. She rummaged through the unit, which she was now beginning to see not as a pile of junk, but as a chest of supplies. She found what she was looking for in the bottom of a cardboard barrel filled with old gardening tools. A crowbar, heavy and solid, its paint chipped, its end sharpened to a fine, wicked point. It felt good in her hands. Solid. Real. She stood before the back wall, the crowbar a strange scepter in her hand. Measure twice, cut once. She took the small brass key and held it up to the wall, positioning it exactly where the X was on her map. The cloverleaf head was her guide. She used a piece of chalk she found in Maeve's sewing box to trace the shape of the key's bit onto the corrugated metal. A small, precise rectangle. That was her mark. That was the starting point. She took a deep breath, braced herself, and plunged the tip of the crowbar into the center of the chalk rectangle. The sound of metal piercing metal was a violent shriek that echoed in the confined space. It was a point of no return. She had scarred the wall. Now she had to break it. She leveraged the crowbar, putting her whole weight into it. The metal groaned, protested, and then, with a sickening pop, a small section of the seam gave way. A crack of darkness appeared. She worked with a frantic energy now, using the crowbar to pry and tear, following the invisible lines of Maeve's design. It wasn't a random act of destruction. It was a deconstruction, a careful unmaking. The thin metal skin of the wall peeled back like the lid of a tin can, revealing not insulation or studs, but a void. A dark, narrow space. She had been right. It was a false wall. As she pulled back the last section of mangled metal, she was hit by a wave of cool, dry air that smelled of sawdust, linseed oil, and something else. Something clean and melodic. She shone her flashlight into the gap, and her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a space, it was a room. A secret room, no more than 3 feet deep but running the entire 10-foot width of the unit. And it was not empty. The opposite wall was lined with shelves, from floor to ceiling. And on the shelves, arranged in neat, perfect rows, were dozens and dozens of small wooden boxes. They were music boxes. Each one was carved from a different wood: pale maple, rich cherry, dark walnut. Some were intricately detailed, with inlaid patterns of birds and flowers. Others were plain and simple, their beauty found in the grain of the wood itself. Each one was a small work of art, a vessel of quiet, painstaking craftsmanship. And on the front of each box, a small brass plate had been affixed. On the plates were carved 2 things: an address and a date. Next to the shelves of music boxes sat a small, sturdy workbench. On it, a set of carving tools lay in a neat row on a leather roll, their wooden handles worn smooth with use. A small vise was bolted to the edge of the bench, and jars of stains and oils were lined up with military precision. And next to the tools, a stack of thick, leather-bound books. Ledgers. This was Maeve's secret. This was her hidden life. The woman who baked cookies and tended a window box garden was also a master craftsman, a secret artist who had filled the dark with music. At that moment, she heard the rumble of the main door rolling up. Light flooded the unit, silhouetting two figures. One was Sal, his face pale and sweating. The other was Marcus Thorne. He was not smiling. Behind them, a crew of two men in work jumpsuits stood with empty hand trucks. "Time's up," Thorne said, his voice flat and cold. "As I told you, this facility is scheduled for demolition. For liability reasons, all units must be cleared. Immediately." He held up a piece of paper. "Your lease has been terminated for non-payment. These men are here to clear the contents." It was a lie. A blatant, transparent lie. The first of the month was still a week away. He had manufactured a crisis, a deadline, to force her out. He was done negotiating. "You can't do this," Alara said, her voice shaking, but not with fear. With rage. "I can," Thorne said simply. "And I am. Get out of the way." He nodded to his men. They started forward. "Stop!" Alara shouted, planting herself in front of the ruined back wall, the crowbar still in her hand. "There's nothing here for you. It's just junk." Thorne's eyes narrowed. He looked past her, at the dark opening she was guarding, at the glint of something on the shelves behind her. His suspicion had just hardened into certainty. "Get her out of here," he snapped at his men. But before they could move, another voice cut through the tension. "What in God's name is going on here?" It was Lena. She stood at the entrance of the unit, a bag of groceries in one arm, her face a thundercloud. She had come to check on Alara, to bring her lunch. She took in the scene in a single sweeping glance. Alara, pale but defiant. Thorne, his face a mask of cold fury. The work crew, hesitating. "Thorne!" Lena spat the name like a curse. "Still preying on women and orphans, I see." She dropped her groceries and marched into the unit, placing herself shoulder to shoulder with Alara. The community had started to arrive. And the climax was about to begin. The confrontation drew a small crowd. Other tenants, drawn by the shouting, peeked out of their own units. Sal stood by the door, wringing his hands, a man caught between a rock and a hard place. "This is a private matter," Thorne said, trying to regain control. "This woman is trespassing." "The hell she is," Lena retorted. "She owns this unit. I saw the receipt. Now, what is so important in this pile of so-called junk that a man like you has to come down here and handle it personally?" Thorne ignored her. His eyes were fixed on the dark space behind Alara. "I'm going to say this one last time," he said to his crew. "Clear it out." One of the workmen, a big man with a weary face, took a hesitant step forward. Alara didn't move. She just looked at him. "My grandmother made things," she said, her voice clear and steady now. "She fixed things for people. Did she ever fix something for you?" The man stopped. A flicker of confusion, then recognition, crossed his face. Thorne's face was a study in controlled rage. "Do your job," he barked. But the spell was broken. Lena stepped forward and picked up one of the leather-bound ledgers from the workbench in the hidden room. She opened it, her finger running down a page of neat, precise script. "December 10th, 1998, she read aloud, her voice ringing out in the suddenly silent hallway. "Address, 142 Elm Street. Recipient, the Miller family. Occasion, birth of first child, Sarah. Payment, a slice of homemade apple pie and a promise to check on old Mr. Abernathy." From the back of the small crowd, a woman gasped. That's my Sarah," she whispered. "We had a music box. It played Brahms' Lullaby. It was lost when we moved." Lena flipped a page. March 2nd, 2005. Address, 38B River Apartments. Recipient, Anna Petrova. Occasion, recovery from illness. Payment, 2 jars of beet borscht. Sal, the manager, went pale. Anna, that's my sister, he choked out. She was so sick. Someone left a music box for her. It played a song from the old country. We never knew who it came from. One by one, Lena read the entries. Each one was a story, a small act of kindness, a hidden stitch in the fabric of the community. A music box for a wedding, a music box for a graduation, a music box for a funeral, to hold a memory when grief was too loud. The ledgers weren't accounts of debt, they were a record of grace. They were Maeve's true legacy. The crowd grew, people drawn by the stories, by the whispered name of the woman who had secretly been the heart of their neighborhood. They saw the shelves of music boxes, a library of love, and they understood. Thorne stood alone, his authority evaporating under the weight of 100 small kindnesses. The final blow came when Lena read one last entry. August 14th, 2019. Address 91 Weaver Lane. Recipient George and Maria Flores. Occasion 50th wedding anniversary. Payment a story about the day they met. An old man in the crowd, his face weathered and kind, let out a sob. That was our house, he said, his voice thick with tears. Thorne Consolidated bought the land. They tore it down last month. We lost everything. We thought we'd lost the music box forever. He pointed a trembling finger at Thorne. You told us everything was cleared. You told us it was all just rubble. All eyes turned to Thorne, the developer who erased history. The man who had just demolished a house containing a treasure he was now trying to steal. His face was white, his composure shattered. He was exposed, not by a lawyer or a judge, but by a ledger full of pie and promises. It was then that Sal, the redeemable antagonist, the man who had been complicit in his fear, finally broke. He knew, Sal cried out, tears streaming down his face. He knew there was something here. He told me to rush the auction, to keep the manifest vague. At the last minute, I swapped the unit number on the public listing with C14, an empty one. I was trying to buy her some time, to hide it. I knew Maeve. She was good to my sister. I owed her. But he found out. He threatened my job, my pension. He walked over to Alara, his shoulders slumped in shame. I'm sorry, he said. I was a coward. He then turned to Thorne, his face filled with a newfound shaky courage. I quit, he said. And you need to leave. Now. The crowd, a silent chorus moments before, found its voice. A low murmur started, growing into a unified demand. Leave! They formed a quiet, solid wall of bodies between Thorne and the unit, a human barrier built of shared history and repaid debts. Marcus Thorne, the man who measured the world in dollars and square footage, looked at the faces in the crowd, the faces of the people he had dismissed as worthless, and for the first time, he saw their true value. And it terrified him. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his retreat not a dignified exit, but a rout. He had been defeated, not by money or by power, but by a quiet legacy of kindness, a girl with her grandmother's hands, and a community that had finally remembered how to be a quilt. The aftermath was not loud. There were no cheers, no victory speeches. As Thorne's car sped out of the gravel lot, a quiet, almost reverent hush fell over the group. The anger dissipated, leaving behind something softer, more constructive. The community, which had been a loose collection of strangers, had cohered. They were a we now. People didn't just drift away, they stayed. The old man, George Flores, walked slowly into the hidden workshop and ran a trembling hand over a small walnut music box, the one with his address on the brass plate. Ilara took it from the shelf and handed it to him. He wound the small key on the bottom, and a delicate tinkling melody filled the air, a sound that was both joyful and heartbreakingly sad. It was the sound of something lost being found. That was the signal. One by one, others stepped forward, speaking the names of loved ones, recalling a forgotten song, a special occasion. Sal, his face still streaked with tears but his eyes clear, brought a folding table and a chair from his office. Lena, ever practical, started taking names and addresses, cross-referencing them with the ledgers. The unit, once a tomb of forgotten things, became a bustling, hopeful place. It was a reclamation project. The two workmen, who had stood frozen during the confrontation, quietly picked up their hand trucks. But instead of clearing the unit, they began helping, their heavy lifting expertise now used not for demolition but for restoration. They carefully moved the cedar chest and the few pieces of furniture Alara wanted to keep, arranging them to make more room. They created a space for people to sit, to wait, to share their stories of Maeve. Alara did not choose revenge. She could have called the police, a lawyer. The evidence of Thorne's malfeasance was all there. But she knew that wasn't Maeve's way. Justice, for Maeve, wasn't about punishment. It was about restoration. It was about making things whole. So she refused the easy path of anger and chose the harder path of work. The music boxes were not for sale. That was the first and only rule. They were not commodities to be traded. They were debts of kindness to be repaid. Her work, she realized, was to be Maeve's executor, not of a will, but of a philosophy. The days that followed took on a new shape. The storage unit became a strange kind of community center. Sal, now unemployed but freer than he had been in years, became Alara's unofficial partner. He knew the building, the people, the logistics. He helped her organize. Lena kept them supplied with coffee and sandwiches. The community chorus became a volunteer army. They helped clean the other music boxes, polishing the wood, carefully checking the delicate mechanisms. Each box was a sacrament. As they worked, they told stories. Stories about Maeve, of course, but also stories about themselves, about the neighborhood, about the lives intertwined by the secret threads she had woven. Alara, who had felt so utterly alone, found herself at the center of a family she hadn't known she had. It was a family built not of blood, but of shared purpose, a family, as Maeve had said, that was built, not born. They transformed the unit. The junk was cleared, sorted, and donated. The broken back wall was taken down completely, opening up the workshop and making it a permanent part of the space. It was cleaned and painted. The workbench became the heart of the operation. Buster, the loyal witness, spent his days sleeping in a patch of sun by the door, a silent, furry mascot for their unlikely enterprise. One afternoon, a week after the confrontation, a sleek black car pulled into the lot. It wasn't Thorne. It was a woman in a sharp business suit, a lawyer representing a now absent Marcus Thorne. She offered Alara a check, a significant sum, for her silence. A non-disclosure agreement, a way to quietly bury the whole affair. Alara looked at the check, at the dizzying number of zeros. It was more money than she had ever seen. It was a ticket out, a new life. She looked around the bustling workshop, at Sal laughing with Mr. Flores, at Lena pouring coffee for one of the volunteers. She looked at the shelves, still half full of waiting music boxes. She thought of Maeve's words. Worth is not the same as price. She pushed the check back across the table. We're not finished here, she said. The lawyer left, confused. Alara had chosen meaning over money. She had chosen to stay and finish the work. The legacy was now hers to carry. Months passed. The seasons turned. The chill of autumn gave way to the quiet cold of winter, and then the first tentative warmth of spring. Most of the music boxes had been returned, each delivery a small, emotional ceremony. The unit was cleaner now, emptier, but more full than ever. Alara had found a small apartment nearby, but the workshop was her true home. She had started spending her evenings at the workbench, studying Maeve's tools, her sketches, her half-finished projects. She was learning the language of the wood, the feel of a sharp chisel, the patience required to make something beautiful and true. One late spring afternoon, as the sun streamed through the open door, a young couple hesitated at the entrance. They looked lost, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion. "Excuse me," the young man said. "We were looking for the manager. Our unit. There was a fire in our building. We lost everything. We just have a few things here." Alara listened to their story, a story of loss and displacement that was achingly familiar. She poured them a cup of coffee. She let them talk. She saw the hole in their lives, the need for something more than just a place to store their remaining possessions. After they left, their immediate problems solved by Sal, Alara went to the workbench. She picked up a small, unadorned block of pale maple, feeling its weight, its smoothness. She took up Maeve's favorite carving knife, its wooden handle a perfect fit in her hand. Buster came over and lay his gray head on her knee. She began to carve. She was not copying one of Maeve's designs. She was creating something new, something for the young couple. A new song for a new story. The camera pulls back, showing the quiet concentration on her face, her hands moving with a growing confidence, a familiar grace. The legacy was alive. It was being passed forward not by possession, but by repetition. Her hands, so like her grandmother's, worked the wood, bringing order from chaos, making a small, beautiful thing to fill a hole in the world. Worth is not the same as price. The work continues.